Thank you to the Netherland-America Foundation, and thank you to Harvard Bookstore. Thank you very much, and thanks to all local bookstores. They are a crucial part of our community. That's my tag from my former life on City Council. The full house tonight, which is wonderful. We get to talk to and listen to Russell Shorto, who has written this absolutely fabulous book. And when I was asked by NAF to be the person who gets to ask the questions, I thought I better get caught up on this guy and learn a little bit about him. So I listened to his first book, The Island at the Center of the World, which is really about the Dutch part of the story. And you've written a follow-on book, which is about the Dutch and the English part of the story, if that's a fair statement.
Yeah.
So I thought, how am I going to get this guy to bring us into the world that he creates so effectively in his writing and in his ability to tell wonderful stories? We all know the difference between a story that's just a story and a story that's based in fact and a story that's based in history. And you tell the stories that are based in history and based in fact. And we are grateful to you. Welcome to Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Thank you very much.
You are in some ways, and I think you'll agree with this, in the belly of the beast. Because we're about 100 yards from Harvard Yard, right here, and 100 yards from Harvard Square down there.
I'm sure there are a lot of Puritans here.
Well, we're gonna get into that because you get into that in the story. So what I thought I would do is, I thought, well, we're gonna do this in a little bit of a trope, a little bit of a shtick, if you will. And what I'm gonna do to poor Russell here is I'm gonna give him prompts. And I'm gonna give him a couple of words or a couple of names, and he's gonna then have to respond and react and fill in the story. So we're really gonna lean on him and his amazing ability to do storytelling. He's allowed to expand beyond the prompts that I give him, but the idea is to walk him through this period of history, which is so fascinating. We know the English side here in Massachusetts, but there's a long and profound Dutch side in New York City. Welcome once again, Russell. So for anybody who has any connection to New York, and I do, I'm one of those people, you know some Dutch words, you know some Dutch names. You know the name Brooklyn, you know the Bronx, you know Long Island is actually originally a Dutch name, Harlem, the Bowery, Yonkers, and you also know some Dutch words that have come into the English language. Cookies, right? Coleslaw,
Yep.
Santa Claus, and then a word that you say in your first book, which is the quintessentially Dutch word, boss. He's not my master, he's not my lord, but he is my boss. And that is a Dutch word. And and you tell wonderful stories. It may also be a Dutch word. I don't know this, and I did Google this. Yankees might be a Dutch word. Might be a Dutch word. There's some question about that. All right. With that, I want you to take us back to 1624, when the Dutch first stepped foot on Manhattan Island. And to give you your prompt, I want you to take us into the world of that time and the Europeans of that time. And here are some of the Europeans who were alive then or around then. Galileo Galilei, Thomas Hobbes, René Descartes, Rembrandt, Kepler. So what was that world, that European world, that the Dutch left and decided to get in a boat and travel to lands unknown to New York?
Okay, first, thank you, Sam. Thank you, Harvard Bookstore. Thank you, Netherland-America Foundation. Thank you all very much for being here. It is, when you're launching a book in the world, I always start with, well, I think my mother at least will read it. And then slowly, with gatherings like this, especially when it's a full house, I start to think, okay, maybe a few more people will read it too. So thank you very much for helping to launch a book. That was the world. It was the world. It's the beginning of the modern era. The beginning of the age of science and reason. People are used to thinking of the Enlightenment of the 18th century. The Enlightenment of the 18th century comes out of the Dutch Enlightenment of the 17th century. The Netherlands, I go into this in the book in talking about the society that was built up there. It was an unusually open place, unusually tolerant, relatively tolerant. We can talk about what it did and didn't mean. And it was a place that, because of that, drew intellectuals from other parts of Europe. You mentioned Galileo. He had his books published in the Low Countries. Descartes moved there, spent much, or if not most, of his adult life there. It was Europe was. It was one foot in the Middle Ages and one foot in the modern world, and the Netherlands was a relatively inviting place for intellectual pursuits. So why then did people leave it is a question. I'm sure we're going to get to England too. England during this century is bitterly divided with the rise of the Puritans. And of course, then we come to the English Civil War. So there's a lot of people fleeing England, coming to places like this, coming to the New World to set up, they hope, a new life. It was harder for the Dutch to get settlers because it was the so-called Golden Ages. In the Netherlands, it's kind of, a few years ago, the Amsterdam Museum caused a big stir by saying we're no longer going to say Golden Age because it wasn't golden for a lot of people. But the so-called Golden Age, it was a good time, and it was an era of building and ferment and intellectual excitement. So it was hard. So what they had to do was they had to get newcomers, immigrants from other places to go on these ships and to come to the middle of nowhere.
And a word that I actually didn't write down on my little sheet here, but it's a big part of this, was, I'm going to call it the Dutch East India Company, but maybe I've got the name wrong. But that was heading towards the east, and the trade, largely in spices, I believe, that made the Netherlands an incredibly wealthy country, but they'd also wanted to go west. And why did they want to go into the Atlantic as well? What was that all about?
Well, the Dutch East India Company forms at the beginning of the century, and that's what really sparks this golden age. It starts, they had been seafarers, the Dutch, and they had long wanted to get their own route to Asia, and there was one voyage that was sent from Amsterdam in the late 1500s or the 1590s, and it was this horrendous mission, and they finally made it to what is now Indonesia, and years later they came back, just a bedraggled few. They were scurvy-ridden, lost their teeth, most of them had died. And yet they brought a few sacks of cinnamon, so everybody cheered because it showed it could be done. On the strength of that, they formed a new kind of company, a new enterprise. Before that, companies were formed. A group of individuals got together and pooled their resources and backed a voyage, for example. The ships went out, got the stuff, came back, everybody divided it up, and the company came to an end. The Dutch East India Company was the first permanent multinational company, and these shares of stock, as they called them, could be bought by anyone. Now, mostly they were bought by rich people, because that's who buys most stock today. But there were ordinary people who bought shares too. A couple of shares were bought by housemaids. So that was this new enterprise in which ordinary Dutch people could participate in the economic life of their society. So that launches then the Dutch East India Company, which, as you say, Sam, goes to what they called the East Indies, which means Asia. And that was, it turned out that was relatively easy pickings, because they were things like spices and pepper, which you could pack your ship with, and it would have enormous wealth. I mean, the markup was tremendous on it. Then they thought, well, let's do the same thing with the West Indies. And the West Indies means if you're in Western Europe and you're looking at a map, everything to the west, basically everything to your left. So with coastal North America, the Caribbean, and South America. So it seemed obvious, well, let's do the same thing. And in 1621, they formed the West India Company. And it proved to be much harder. The West India Company overall, over these decades, really slugged to make a profit. And out of that, as part of that, comes the settlement of New Netherland, which is with its capital on Manhattan Island.
And I want to take us to Manhattan Island, but before we get to Manhattan Island, we've mentioned the English, and we will get to the English more in this, but we also, I think it's important also to mention Spain, who is the dominant power, I think, and certainly the dominant maritime power at the time. And one of the things I take away from your book is that, your first book particularly, is that it is a competition between Spain and the Netherlands, at least in terms of maritime power and control of the seas. Is that a fair statement? Is that accurate?
Yeah, well, at the time, I mean, in broad strokes, in the 1500s, Spain and Portugal ruled the seas. They were the dominant powers in Europe. And then what is happening, although it probably wasn't evident to people, when you're living in it, the Spanish Empire was beginning to wane. And these two other European powers, first the Dutch and then a little later the English, start to rise. And when they were in the midst of their empire, Spain made essentially vassal states out of the Dutch provinces. And it was a reciprocal thing because the Dutch provinces weren't united as one nation. And yet they were these little economic powerhouses. And so they were able to pay taxes to fill the Spanish coffers. And in exchange, they got protection. And that worked until it didn't.
Right. And I mean, there's so much in your book about that, and it's absolutely fascinating. But let's travel to New York now. Mm-hmm. So 1624, the Dutch land on Manhattan Island. And why don't you just spend a minute, if you would, on the name Manhattan all by itself?
Sure.
Where does the name come from?
It seems to be a Munsee word. The Munsee or Lenape or Delaware were the people who inhabited what later became the New York City region, out westward into New Jersey and south to Delaware. And the best guess is that it means something like a place where we gather wood for making bows.
Right. And it is referred to as the island of the Manhattoes, right? I think you often referred to that in the book. People referred to that at the time. The other specific thing, we're going to get more into the broader conversation, related to Manhattan Island. Well, let's go to Manhattan Island, and I'll bring up Broadway next, because that's the other thing is sort of fascinating history. So here's your prompt on Manhattan Island. So the Dutch are there, and here are three categories or names. One is, this goes back to your first book, Adrian van der Donk, who is a fascinating character, my little thing. This is a three-parter, The Fur Trade, Waterways, $24. You can go any direction on that one. Yeah. And then Leiden University. We're in a university town. So those are your prompts. You can tell any story you want about Manhattan, but bring us to the island of Manhattan in the early 17th century.
I like how you set this up like it's a test and a quiz. How well do I remember my own books?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm trying to connect all those things. You said the $24 purchase, right?
Right, and
okay.
you don't actually need to connect them.
Okay.
More importantly, that we hear a great story about this place.
So when the Dutch arrived in their colony, they were always very meticulous about paperwork. And they wanted to get a deed. They wanted to negotiate a deed for the island of Manhattan. And I think they negotiated something like 600 deeds with native people over the 40-odd years of the life of this Dutch colony, up and down the Hudson River and all over. And the first that we know of was for Manhattan Island, and the most infamous, maybe the most infamous, from our perspective, swindle in history. So the deed itself has been lost. What we have is what is called the Peter Scoggin letter, which I curated an exhibit at the New York Historical last year for the 400th anniversary of the founding. And their 2024, 2025, and 2026 are all considered the 400th anniversary. We can get into why that is. And we actually got the Peter Skagen letter for the exhibit on loan from the Biblioteca Lorenziana in Florence, which owns it. This is after this deed was negotiated on Manhattan. A ship sailed to the home country, and a government official named Peter Skagen was there and did what they, I guess, always did, which was they interview the passengers and the captain, and then he wrote a report to his bosses and said, our colony is doing well, some of the women have given birth, they've planted crops, and oh, by the way, they have purchased the island of Manhattan from the native people for the value of 60 guilders. And that's that's the thing that gets translated in the 19th century and converted into 19th century currency to $24. Now, I can talk the whole hour about that and what it meant and what it didn't, but I won't. In brief, the Dutch knew perfectly well that the native people did not have a concept of real estate and property transfer and that kind of transaction. Nevertheless, they wanted to have something like that for other Europeans, the English in particular, to show them, no, we've got this. They knew that for the native people, what they were willing to get involved in was a kind of alliance, whereby, because for the native people, they were in it for something too. They valued European manufactured goods. And they were saying, in effect, okay, you can live here, we can trade with each other, and if one of us is attacked, the other one will help out. And that was maybe what the Dutch had in mind initially, but within a few years, as time goes by, and especially as they get stronger, they start to look at it in their own real estate terms and say, no, this is ours, get out. And they start to push them out, and that begins this process, which, they push them further and further west, and the English were doing the same thing here, pushing them out. And that's one way of looking at the story of America.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. And there's a story you have in there, and I don't remember the name. I'm going to try to describe it so that you'll remember it, of a Dutch person, I think, who was posted in Albany and was approached by one of the two tribes. I don't remember what the tribes were up there, for aid, for help. And he went out. He was not supposed to leave the fort. He was not supposed to side with either side in this dispute that predated European arrival, but he decided to, yes, go out of the fort, and he was shot dead with an arrow, I believe, in your story. And you know his name, and I thought, what an amazing story, this guy in this wilderness in 1620 whatever, but it was a very impactful story. I don't know if that's ringing any bells with you or not.
Yeah. So this precipitates the purchase of Manhattan Island. So when they came initially to this colony, the idea was, according to the European logic, you got as much land as you could, and you had to settle it, which means having men and women raising families there and growing crops, and then you had to maintain it. But the earlier, as we discussed earlier, they had a hard time getting enough people. So they had just a handful of initial settlers, this is in 1624, come, and they got sort of Adams and Eves. They got young couples, and they had them spread over this whole region from Delaware into parts of Pennsylvania and New York, and some on the Connecticut River. And then these were up at around what is now Albany, and they had some soldiers there. And the soldiers got involved in a dispute between the Mohican, who were on the east bank of the Hudson River, and the Mohawk, who were on the west bank. And some of the soldiers got shot. Daniel van Kriekenbeck is the leader. And when this happens, initially they were there to do business with the native people. They wanted to have peaceable relations. And when this happens, it sends shockwaves through this whole thinly spread community. And so there was an initial director of the colony, a man named Verhulst, who apparently wasn't a very good leader. After this happens, the settlers themselves said, "You're fired," and they got a new guy, Peter Minuit, to lead them. And he said, "All right, this is ridiculous. We have to recall everyone." So he pulls everyone in to New York Harbor, as it later became known, And that's when they decided this place at the tip of Manhattan Island will be our capital.
Yeah. And we're now going to begin to talk about the English because they're the other part of this story. Let's use this story as a transition point of the different attitudes that the Dutch and the English had about settling lands. Because the Dutch had this notion that you had to be in the land, live on it, and actually be there. I believe that's correct. Where the English had a very different concept of what belonged to England and what they had to do to actually gain land. Without going more into that, can you tell us what that was all about?
Yeah, the contiguity, the idea that, if you send someone to chart a region, wherever his or her foot touches, magically, everything all the land that stretches from that is yours. And this is what England eventually, so England, just to cut to the chase, England establishes colonies in New England and in Virginia and Maryland. And when they are finally starting to say, oh, the Dutch have this piece in the middle, what they say is, oh, starting when that happened a century or more ago, all of that was always English land, but we just didn't get around to settling this part. In the meantime, the Dutch, these interlopers, got in there. So that was their legal basis for taking the land from the Dutch.
All right, so here are your prompts on the English. It follows the same rules. You can go anywhere with this, but here are your 3 names or words. Sir George Downing, the slave trade, Harvard University.
Okay, well, so I can see a connection here. Sir George Downing was, I think, the first class. He was in the first class to graduate from Harvard. He is a really interesting figure who sort of looms over this whole period of history. He was brilliant, and he was odious. Everyone who knew him despised him. He goes to England and it becomes the ambassador, the English ambassador to the Netherlands, and as such, he is an advisor on this whole issue of what to do about the American colonies. He knows it because he lived here. And he has a sense of, and he knows the Dutch side, and he knows who the people were who founded this Dutch colony. The slave trade, I'm trying to connect the slave trade to that. Did you have a...
No, you don't have to make any connection.
Oh, okay.
It's just that they...
the slave trade connects to all of this, but...
No, it does. On the Dutch side, we had the fur trade, which was a key driver, both of their activities in North America and their relationship with the Native American populations. The English seemed very... committed to creating a slave trade. I seems to be, anyway. That's one of the things I thought I took from your book, but maybe that's not a fair statement.
No, I mean, if we're going to tell the whole story of the slave trade, the European slave trade, it begins with the Portuguese. They're the ones who really infiltrate deep into Africa. Everyone else is, later saying, oh, what a good idea. And the English and the Dutch were both vying as they're developing their empires. They're both vying for these slaving posts in West Africa, and looking to develop to use slave labor in the New World. And England, if you want to get into the story of the English Civil War, the Puritans taking.
That's a prompt coming up, but yes,
Okay.
go ahead.
The English Civil War, the Puritans behead the king, Charles I, in 1649. His sons, the 2 princes, flee into exile on the continent. Then eventually in 1660, they come back. The monarchy resumes, the Stuart government, and in this period, and really throughout much of the 17th century to this point, the Dutch have built this massive empire, especially with the wealth from the East Indies. But they're in West Africa, they're in India, they were the only nation to trade with Japan. And these 2 royal brothers now, Charles II and his brother James, the Duke of York, really want to play catch up. They're very eager to do that. And they found 3 organizations within months of coming back. One is the Council for Foreign Plantations, which, as its name sounds, is all about colonizing parts of the world. Another is the Royal African Society, which you know where that's going. They were interested in gold and slaves. And the third, interestingly, was the Royal Society for the Advancement of Science, which is, I guess you would say, still the premier organization for the advancement of science. And it's related because, you know, even though it's hard to fit those concepts together, at this period, as we started out talking about, this is the age of the beginning of science and scientific experimentation, and these people who were saying, yes, let's have a slaving industry because we'll grow wealthy on it, are also, you know, tinkering and doing experiments and wind and waves and, you know. And at the same time, the Royal Society was connected to colonization because the idea was you would establish a colony in the Caribbean or in North America or whatever, and then you would start looking for new minerals and things like that, and doing experiments. So all of those things were part of what they were about. And I'm not sure if I answered the question.
No, I think you're doing very well, and I'm sorry to sort of put you on the spot. I think it's my inner New Yorker.
No, this is kind of fun. I don't know if it's fun for you.
But I figure there's nothing more fun than just watching a guy trying to figure out what is this guy.
Where is he going?
Yeah, exactly. All right, so we're going to go back to New York now. We're going to go back to New York, and we're going to go to what I have on my little sheet here as the main actors, the leading actors in the drama that you spell out in your wonderful book, Taking Manhattan. And those 2 actors are Peter Stuyvesant and Richard Nichols. First of all, who are they? Mm-hmm. And why am I calling them the main actors?
Because I set the story up that way. I mean,
brilliant.
You read the book, and I just,
done.
In terms of how I do history, I am a storyteller, and I believe in narrative, and I believe that's the oldest way of understanding our past, and I think it's a valid way. And that means, to me, finding conflict, finding 2 people or 2 sides in conflict. And in here, I mean, ultimately what you have is the English sailing these warships into the harbor, and they're pointing their cannons at this fort at the tip of Manhattan Island, and the Dutch are in their fort pointing their cannons back, and that's, I mean, you can't get more conflict than that. And Stuyvesant is the leader of the Dutch, and Nichols is the leader for the English. Now, the story, as I tell it, I focus on those 2 because they are officially the leaders, but especially in New Amsterdam, Peter Stuyvesant's whole town is part of this drama. There are about 1,500 people in New Amsterdam, speaking a variety of languages and of different faiths and backgrounds. And as this is transpiring, and you know, we all know how this is going to end. But they don't, of course, and that's what I find fascinating, and that's what I challenge myself to do when I'm writing history. If you get to it from the perspective of the people on the ground, you don't know what's going to happen. And so these 1,500 people, especially as Peter Stuyvesant, who was something of a hothead, lets his temper get away with him several times during this, what's going to be a 2-week encounter in the late summer of 1664. He basically says, that's it. Gunners, go to your cannons. We're blasting away. When this happens, basically the whole town, Stuyvesant and his soldiers wanted to fight, but everybody else did not. So that's the tension in the town. And so what I do in the book is I also focus on a cross-section of different people from the town. To give the perspective sort of on the ground. So Stuyvesant is the leader for the Dutch. He's very capable. He is the last director of the colony. There were several before him. He was there for 17 years. When he arrived, and the story that I tell in my earlier book, The Island at the Center of the World, is centered on his arrival and this confrontation that he has with his own people, his own colonists. And that comes out of his predecessor, Willem Kieft, had decided, in his wisdom, to declare war on the native people around New Amsterdam. The colonists were opposed to this because they were there to do business with them and because they were outnumbered by them. So that leads to this enormous strife within the colony. And that's where Adrian van der Donck comes in. He leads this kind of popular uprising almost. Kieft is eventually recalled, and he is replaced by Peter Stuyvesant. When Stuyvesant comes in, he's the stern son of a Calvinist minister, and he's going to take charge. So he's got to really be strong and put his foot down with these colonists, and they don't respond. They don't back down. So this whole internal strife really threatens to get out of hand, and that's kind of the main story that I tell in the earlier book. But what's interesting, and that's part of the story in this book, is in the years following, he matures and he comes to understand. He was sent by the West India Company to be the director of this colony and to carry out the orders of the directors, who are in Europe. They're never going to come to America. They don't really have a sense of what's going on in America. And so he realizes that the only way this place is going to succeed is if his community, his mixed community, people from all over, most of whom are traders who have their own business networks in the Caribbean and different parts of Europe, the only way it's going to succeed is if they succeed. So he decides he has to redefine his job description so that he's going to be a middleman between the West India Company directors and these people on the ground. And that then is what leads to the success of New Amsterdam as this vibrant little trading post. And that then is like this ripening fruit that the English finally decide they have to have. Now, do you want me to do Nichols now? Or?
Yeah, so let's go into Nichols, and I just want to be mindful. I don't know when they're going to cut us off from talking, but we go into Nichols, and because New Amsterdam eventually becomes New York, and that's
Spoiler alert.
there you go. So and that's kind of the story. So let's hear about Richard Nichols.
Okay, so Richard Nichols really, I mean, as a writer of history, what I love is finding a character, a historical figure, who was enormously consequential and who, I mean, how many people had heard of Richard Nichols? Okay. And who is unheard of, you know, so you get this chance to do that, to unearth this or bring him back to life, in effect. So Richard Nichols leads this expedition on behalf of the English. Where did he come from? Why did they pick him? So I researched his life mostly at the Bodleian Library at Oxford University and at the National Archives in the UK. And he, at the time of King Henry VIII, long before this story, Henry VIII settles a royal hunting preserve around this town called Ampthill in Bedfordshire. Charles I, before he's beheaded, goes there all the time with his sons. The keeper of this hunting ground was the father of Richard Nichols. So they would come there regularly, the Stuarts, and these little boys would play together. The royal family lived in the Great Lodge with Richard Nichols' family. So this guy, this kid, Richard Nichols, grows up with these two royal princes. They go through the Civil War together. He fights alongside them. They're in exile together. He's part of this secret spy network to get them back on the throne. They come back on the throne. They look across the Atlantic and they say, okay, now we want to do two things. We want to take that Dutch colony from them, and we want to deal with New England, because yes, New England was settled by the English, but they were the wrong English as far as they were concerned. They were the Puritans, who were the people who had cut off their father's head, and who were still, the Puritans here still thought of themselves as enemies of the Stuart government. So they appoint this man who they've known since they were all little children to undertake these two very difficult missions. And they know, I mean, you can't, once he was here, it was going to get complicated. He can't phone home for instructions. So they had to, I mean, their instructions to him are basically, figure it out. So his ships were loaded with gunpowder and weapons. They figured, especially with the Dutch, it was going to be bloodshed. But he had to figure it out. And just to jump ahead, So there they are in the harbor, Nichols with his ships and the cannons, and Stuyvesant in the fort. And the real core of the book then is this 2-week period in the late summer of '64. And Nichols doesn't immediately open fire. He anchors in Gravesend Bay because Gravesend is an English village within the Dutch colony. And he sends messengers on a boat. And then Stuyvesant sends messengers back, and they go back and forth, and they're feeling each other out because Stuyvesant knows perfectly well these English are not the New England English. These English are the people who founded the Royal Society, and by the way, Stuyvesant had interesting relations with some of the Royal Society members. These are people maybe who are not so different from us. They're practical, they're pragmatic, they want to do business. And so that ultimately is what happens. They realize that they can work together. Now, from Stuyvesant's, from the Dutch perspective, the Dutch had been trying for years to get the West India Company to support them. They'd been saying, look, we've got this colony, we've got this city, and look how well it's doing, and we've got this whole continent we can exploit. But we need settlers, we need soldiers, we need your support. And it was nothing. They got nothing back from the Dutch government or the West India Company. So they realized by this point, and not just Stuyvesant, but his whole town, that they were on their own. So essentially, that's what Stuyvesant wants. He wants security and continuity for what he created here. Nichols comes to realize that, and he started in London. He started by interviewing people who had lived in the Dutch colony. And I think by the time he sails into the harbor, he desperately does not want to destroy the place, because what he has realized is it's not just the real estate. He sees what's going on. He sees this thriving community. He doesn't understand because, a multi-ethnic society was a strange thing in Europe at the time. And these building blocks of capitalism that they're using was strange. So he knows he can't replicate it. He wants them to stay. So they hash out an agreement. And essentially, it's the so-called articles, it has been called Articles of Surrender, but if it were really a surrender, they would have said, surrender your weapons, surrender yourselves. Instead, it's much more like a Bill of Rights. They are guaranteeing the Dutch, and this is what they hashed out in these back and forth with messengers. You're going to keep your home, you'll keep your family, you'll keep your business, your global trade networks. Please, by all means, keep all of that. Dutch ships can keep coming here. Only thing is, it's going to be English. And then Nichols himself decides, and he writes to the Duke of York and says, I named this place New York. So he even chose the name. So Nichols, to get back to the notion of these unknown people who are so consequential, he comes here, he together with Stuyvesant and other people on the ground, create this place. They invent it. They come up with the idea of this, keeping this Dutch base, but making it English and tying it to what's going to be this thriving British Empire as it grows.
We want to let people ask questions. So my final question for you, as we are about to go to all of you, is tell us a little bit, you don't have to tell us a lot, about yourself and why you are so interested in this topic of New York, and what's the process been like of writing these books. And you all should think of your questions, and then we'll go to you at that point.
Well, about myself, I don't know what to say, except I write books, and I love to write history, and I told you I do narrative history. That's my approach. And so I always find one or two central characters and a central conflict, and then once you do that, everything hangs from it. And originally, this started with me living in New York many years ago, living when my daughter was a toddler around the corner from St. Mark's in the Bowery, which is where Peter Stuyvesant's buried, and she would run around and play, and I would look at, and I read the tomb and what it says, and I was impressed by my own ignorance of New York's Dutch beginnings. And I asked friends who were historians of New York, and they didn't know about the Dutch period, which intrigued me. And eventually I learned of a man named Charles Gehring, who has been, since 1974, translating the 12,000 pages of documents of this colony. He's still at it. In fact, on the 15th, which is Saturday, I'll be in Albany giving a talk, for his retirement. So that will be a very special event. And so from that, I developed the idea of telling the story of the colony, which was what the island at the center of the world was. This book came about because that work continued, and in the past 5 or 6 years, they didn't move chronologically through it, but it happened that they got these last few years those records done, and from them, you see in those how vibrant this place is at the end, at its height, and I realized this is how it must have looked to Nichols, for example. So then I thought, oh, well, there's a whole story in itself, which I had overlooked, and I think American history overlooked, because we just assume, well, of course, the English were going to roll the Dutch over and take it. Well, if you don't assume that, then you've got a story.
Yeah, and there's so much about the multiculturalism of the place, the capitalism of the place, and how it compares, and we didn't get into this enough, to the world that existed, 500 yards from where we're sitting right now, sort of the Boston center of the Puritan world,
Sure.
which was a very different kettle of fish, I think that's fair to say. But with that, we're going to go to audience questions at this point, and I guess what we'll do is we'll hand a mic around. Is that the easiest way to do that? So we've got I see a question back there.
Thank you so much. I'm curious, thinking about multicultural New York and New Amsterdam, famously Stuyvesant was an anti-Semite and tried to prevent the Jewish community from growing and thriving in New Amsterdam. So I'm curious, Holland or the Netherlands at the time was thought to be, put in golden age in quotes, but also a place of tremendous tolerance, especially for Jews. Speaking of Europeans at this time, Spinoza, of course, and the Jewish community in Amsterdam. So I'm curious, to what extent, I apologize, there's a little orthogonal to the book, but to what extent was Stuyvesant's animus towards Jews common amongst the members of the Dutch, and then to what extent was it part of the West India Company and other Dutch policy to try to attract Jews or try to have a multicultural world, even to push capitalism at the expense of potentially community cohesion?
Yeah, well, the larger answer is the tolerance. The Dutch had this official policy of tolerance, which obviously did not apply to enslaved Africans. It did not apply to native people. It applied in a limited way to Jews. Stuyvesant was anti-Semitic, which was the norm in Europe. European Christians were frankly anti-Semitic. They thought that Jews were an alien people, and they tolerated them until they didn't. So in that sense, Stuyvesant was typical. The Dutch nevertheless had this official policy of toleration. So when 23 Jews arrive in 1654, he doesn't want this because even though there was an official toleration, he himself, I think, would have much preferred to have a pure society. He writes to the leaders of the New England colonies and says that he admires them, their pure societies, whereas he says his is comprised of the scrapings of all nations. So he doesn't exactly love that. And in particular, he thinks Jews are going to cause trouble. So he wants them out. They appeal. They write to Europe, to the powers that be, and he's overruled. They say, we have this policy, you have to put up with them. He tried to make life difficult for them. So I tell the story in the book of a man named Asser Levy, who the Jewish community appointed as their representative, who repeatedly pushes back for their rights. So you see this policy of tolerance, you see the failure to apply it, and then you see it being, called upon and upheld in a way, and then you see pushback again, which is how things work in societies anyway.
I see a question up here.
Thank you. This is delightful.
Oh, thanks.
Your focus on the Dutch as trading people, colonizing people, successful people in the world is fascinating, and I'm just curious, when you look around at Dutch history, I know of a wonderful novel by David Mitchell about the Dutch colony in Decima in Japan. Have you thought about writing about other places where the Dutch were influential? Think about South Africa, for example.
That is a beautiful novel. I've read it. Yeah, I haven't thought about writing about South Africa. I don't know a whole lot about that story. I think that the Dutch, I wrote a book about a book called Amsterdam, which is a history of the city, and in that I kind of excavate where all this comes from, and it comes from in part from geography, from the fact that the Netherlands is the Low Countries, and it's essentially a vast river delta, and people, after they migrated there in the Middle Ages, they realized they had to, if they were going to stay, they had to build dams and dikes to protect themselves. And that became a collective effort. Every community had to do that, and to this day they still have community water boards and a dijkgraaf, which is like a count, or it's like a aristocratic position in charge of the dikes. And out of that comes a strong collective, and out of that comes strong individuals who, initially after they reclaim land from the sea, they divide it up. So everybody has a piece of land. So they're now real estate owners, whereas in the rest of Europe, people are serfs. And then they realize they can make life better for their children. They look for more opportunities to exploit, and they become entrepreneurs. So that is kind of a quick shorthand of what sets them in motion and leads ultimately to these multinational corporations and how they did things around the world. Yeah, that woman had a hand.
This may be too personal a question for you to answer, but my husband and I are descendants of Aneka Jans, and we wondered if you could tell us a little bit about how she contributed.
No, I thought you were going to say something else when you say too personal a question. That's easy. Anneke Jans was a member of the Dutch colony in New Amsterdam. She married twice. I'm trying to remember the names of her husbands. She amassed... Everardus Bogardus was her second husband. Yeah, he was the minister. And they amassed a great deal of land from New Amsterdam is the financial district. From there up westward or northward. Maybe the most famous thing about her is that land and how it passed. That became Trinity Church claimed ownership of a lot of that, and it was the subject of lawsuits by descendants, maybe your family, your relatives, in the 20th century. In the early 20th century, they were still wrangling over her land.
Other questions? Now's the time to ask them if you have them.
How did the myth of the pilgrims overtake the business of the Dutch? In other words, it's sort of like the founding of this country was in Plymouth, and the Dutch were sort of overlooked.
Yeah, so he's asking how the Pilgrims and the Puritans, that became the dominant myth of American beginnings rather than the Dutch. Well, the simple answer is that the English won. I mean, the English took the Dutch colony, and nobody's going to turn around and say, "Oh, let's tell the story of this, Dutch colony that's been here for 40 years." And the first books about, America as the Promised Land came from the sons of people right here, the Puritan leaders. These were the first printing presses were here. They told the story, and then that gets spun as this very theological notion of we're succeeding here. I'm looking around because they were here, and because we succeeded here, God is favoring what we do. So this is our promised land. This is the shining city on a hill. And then that in the 19th century becomes the notion of manifest destiny. God has given us stewardship over this whole continent, so we can, push out the heathens, and America is ours. So all of that is part of our heritage, because we were, and I still think in funny ways, America looks at the rest of the world through English eyes, even without being aware of it. So it wasn't until the 1970s when there is a movement toward focusing on other ethnicities and nationalities and minorities that, in a funny way, this Dutch colony becomes of interest. And that's when, as I said, Charlie Gehring begins translating these documents. And then as you move forward in time from there, you start to see that this, in fact, well, there, I mean, New York, the Dutch colony, as a multi-ethnic place, you know, that's what struck me when I was first sitting down with Charlie and researching the first book, that you could just as easily tell the story of American beginnings from Lower Manhattan as you could from Boston or Plymouth. And I think both of those are true American beginning stories, and I think they both have their different ideological centers. New York becomes, it's this Dutch-English fusion that becomes an ideology of relatively outward-looking, global, business-minded, practical, pragmatic. And Boston, no offense, becomes this center of Puritan, theocratic, you know, we have the right because God gave us the right sensibility. And, you know, it's just a suggestion. It's not, as a writer of history, I like to try to track ideas, which is impossible, but it's still worthwhile because you want to try to figure yourself out and where you came from. And I think, though, that those two ideological centers, they shift. You know, Boston is no longer Puritan, but they shift around. But those two ideologies and the struggle between them is a way of understanding all of American history. So.
Can do one more question.
So this is more for the historical research, and you have this vast resource of these papers preserved up in Albany that have been translated. And I think about the future historians, where today we have so much information that's been preserved digitally, but then I think in the future, will they be able to read the records of today? And do you ever think of that as a historian, as to what your future historian will have available?
Are you asking about whether digital records will be preserved, will last?
Yeah, I mean, the fact that this paper has
Yeah,
survived
yeah,
400 years,
Yeah.
but I cannot read my diskettes from 1986.
No, that's a really interesting question. A few years ago, I was in the Amsterdam City Archives with the director there, and it's an amazing archive. And they have digitized everything. But the director said to me, I wasn't even thinking about it, but we wonder how long it's going to last, because we know we've got miles and miles of paper here that as long as we keep it dry and, you know, it will last, you know, for 1,000 years or whatever. But this digital stuff, we don't know. We're still, and you have to keep changing the technology and re-upping it. So that's a huge question. I don't have the answer for it, but yeah, it's our whole society is built in a way on very flimsy foundations.
And on that note, I think we can thank Russell Shorto for spending some time with all of us.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks. It was great.